Before you start to render, it is important to remember the overall shape of this flower, which is a cup shape. And you have to think in terms of the lighting for that before you start to render details.
So the first thing you want to do is figure out where your highlight is, which is in this area, and then you want to shade for the overall form before you do anything else. So that's how I'm going to start this. And this is the way you would proceed with every single flower that you're doing, depending on whether it's a cone, a cylinder, or a cup, or even a sphere. You render for the basic shape first before you start putting in any details. So I've started to tone this. I am using a 4H pencil because I want to be very light. I am of the opinion that even though you have light areas on the flower, everything, if it has a color other than white, it should have some tone in it. This will take me a while to do. I am going to ignore any overlapping shadows, any texture. I am just going to shade for form first, which means this is where my highlight is going to be. That is going to be ultimately my lightest area, even though I'm going to put in some value into that area. Remember that your tone should be nice and even. We should not see any pencil lines in the rendering process. So at this point, I have all of the even tone done on the outside of the tulip. Now I'm going to shade on this side and bring it to the highlight. I'm going to shade on this side and bring it to the highlight. And don't forget, this is a cup shape. So as we go down underneath and the petals start to bend toward the stem, it will be a little bit darker than the darkness along these sides. But at this point, I've pretty much put in the values to define the roundness of the form. But I wanted you to see a couple of little things here that are going on. You see these little spots here? This is where the graphite caught on the texture of the paper as I was working the values. It gets everybody a little upset when this happens because they've worked so hard to get nice even tones. But it's really a simple solution. All you really need to do is take your kneaded eraser and put a nice little fine point on it. And then just gently dab in that spot and it'll pick it up. It's just because the graphite catches on some of the fibers on the paper that might be a little firm. Now you're actually going to work with the values that define the contours of the petals and what happens when the light moves in and out of these petals. So here I have a photograph of the flower, and if we look at this, you can see, interestingly enough, there's quite a bit of lightness down in this area. And this will start to show up when you start to put in some of these darks. So that's what we're going to do next. We're going to put in the darks for where the very distinct darks are. For instance, this petal curves in. Because our light is coming really from this direction, it means that we're catching light on the top edges of these rounded petals. We're catching light on the inside of this petal. We're catching light on this edge because it rounds in towards the light, and the same is true here. So you'll see there's definite contrast between the light outer petal at this point and the darker petal on this side. Now the reason that this inner petal is darker than this one is because of the cup shape again. The main light is coming from this direction, so this area here would be slightly in shadow. You're catching light on the outer side of this petal and less on the inner petal. So this inner petal is going to be darker, and you can see overall it is darker than this outer edge. And yet some of these values here are similar to the values here because this petal now comes down away from the light. Here we have overlapping values, so there's a little bit more dimension to the thickness because we've got two petals overlapping one another. So it's helping to block off some of the light. So you can see where these petals overlap, we get darker areas. So we're going to refer to this black and white photograph now in order to put in our more definitive values to actually define this tulip. Now you'll also notice before we go to drawing is you'll see that there are areas here that are dark and light. Do not overemphasize them. Leave those till very last before you put those in. You want to put these shadows in, you want to put these shadows in, you want to put these shadows in. This grades from dark to light. You want to put these shadows in. But this veination here, I would wait before you do anything on that. I would wait with this veination because this whole section here is a little darker, and then this dark area I would put in. So start with the more basic shapes before you go to this little very defined areas. Those should be very subtle and left to the very last. Well, I've switched to a 3H pencil, and I'm going to go then again to a 2H pencil to gradually change. If you find that the pencil is not giving you enough value, go to a softer pencil. But don't go from a 3H down to an HB or to a B just because you know you're going to need it darker in a certain area. Gradually progress. If you're starting with a 3H, is that you should go back down to a 2H, then to an HB, and then to a 2B. Don't jump from a hard pencil to a very soft pencil right away because you're going to get a lot of texture because the soft pencil is going to pick up a lot of tooth and you're going to end up with a lot of flutter in the value unless you transition slowly. And you can always lighten up an area if you think it's gotten too dark, lifting with your kneaded eraser to get the right value that you want. Remember that the harder the pencil, the more it goes into the tooth of the paper and doesn't ride on top of the tooth, which is why it's important to make those transitions from one hardness to another. I'm still looking at where my darkest darks are and what I have to do to make this look very dimensional, even though it's a very light flower. Now, if you look at your stem, you're going to see that your stem is much, much darker overall. So even though you have a highlight in that stem, you can make that stem start with a much darker value. So your highlight on the stem is going to be considerably darker. So I've started this stem with a 3H pencil. We know our highlight is going to be in this area. Put another layer of 3H on here and feathering it to the highlight. And the same is true on this side. Feather to the highlight. I have to go to a softer pencil because I do not want to put pressure on this drawing paper. Now I'm going to switch to a 2H, and that should give me quite a bit of color. Now what I usually do in this area here is I make this whole area here under the flower considerably darker and then let it fade to the highlight because the flower itself blocks the light. So right underneath the flower, you will have darkness that goes almost entirely across the stem. And then I'm going to start putting in some shadow, softening the edge, making sure I have a nice clean edge on the outside and a soft edge on the inside where the highlight comes. And then we'll do this other side. And you can see as I bring up that shadow and darken that shadow, you can see how the highlight is starting to appear. Just make sure that your edges on the outside edges, which are the contour edges, are nice and clean and sharp. Now where I have very light edges, you can use disappearing line a little bit to help define that edge, because in fact there really is an edge there, and as long as you don't make it a full outline edge, it will work very nicely to help define the form. So at this point, we're in pretty good shape in terms of the values. There may be areas that still have to go darker. You can start putting in some of the venation that you see. Just keep it very subtle and make sure it doesn't just end. Make sure that the line feels like it wraps around the petal, because that is in fact what it does. Don't just have lines that float in space. They usually go somewhere from one end to the other, or at least start somewhere and then can fade out. You don't want to just have lines floating in space where they don't make any sense. So you can see how softly I'm doing these. And in many cases I end up having to darken the darker shapes more to give them a little bit more emphasis after I've seen how it looks when the fine venation goes in. So, you know, you're always working a little back and forth in order to get the effect that you want. So we're in pretty good shape at this point. And now once you have your flower in good shape, you can start to render your leaves and other details. First thing you'll notice is that I added more value to the flower because after studying it a bit more, I felt it needed more values to give it more dimension and to bring it up to the appearance that I wanted it to have. Now our flower has been done, and most of the other parts that were required for this assignment are done. We have our pistil. We have our petal with a stamen, and we have a leaf attached to our flower. The last thing that needs to be done yet is the full-size leaf. You should be able to figure out how to do that on your own without any further instruction from me.